Rain does not ask permission before it falls, and neither does danger. On the 48th floor of a city that never quite sleeps, blood moves slower than time, pooling dark against pale marble. A woman's hands are steady over the wound, though nothing else in the room is steady at all. She works in silence, the kind of silence built by years of learning not to be noticed. Somewhere behind her, armed men stand like statues carved from fear itself. They do not fear the gun left on the table. They fear the man bleeding beneath her hands. No one in that room dares look at him directly, as if his silence alone could cut deeper than any blade. He refuses the needle meant to dull his pain, as though pain were the last thing keeping him honest. Outside, a black car waits in the rain, engine breathing quietly, watched by no one, seen by everyone who matters. She does not know yet that stillness like his belongs to men who have buried more than bodies. Her phone trembles once in her pocket, a brother's name flashing unanswered, swallowed by the noise of survival. She silences it without looking, because some nights only allow room for one emergency at a time. And somewhere down the hall, behind a locked door, another phone begins quietly, patiently, to ring. He speaks once low, in a language she does not understand, and the room seems to exhale. It sounds almost like a prayer, though prayer is not a word anyone here would use about him. She has spent her whole life being the one nobody notices in the room. Tonight, for reasons she cannot yet name, he is the only one who notices her at all. A man who commands silence with a glance has just gone quiet because of her hands, not his fear. And somewhere beneath the antiseptic and the rain and the blood, an old question rises again. Who is protecting whom? Because in this city, the most dangerous man in the room is rarely the one holding the gun. Before we go deeper, drop your city, state, or country in the comments, because this story begins in a rain-soaked American city, but the secret started an ocean away, in Seoul. The wound was closing, but the room was not. Zora tied the last knot in the bandage with fingers that had learned long ago never to hesitate, and only then did she let herself breathe. Kang Hyun's chest rose and fell in a slower rhythm now, his pulse settling beneath her palm like a tide, finally deciding to obey the moon. He did not thank her. He did not look away from her either. His eyes stayed fixed on her hands the way a man studies a door he suspects might be the only way out of a burning house. Behind him, Taeshik shifted his weight, gun still loose in his grip, patience worn thin as the lining of an old coat. The rain outside had not softened. It only grew louder, as if the building itself were holding its breath along with everyone inside it. "What's your name?" His voice was quiet, but it filled the room the way smoke fills a closed space, slow and impossible to ignore. Zora did not answer right away. Names were currency in places like this, and she had learned the hard way that giving one away for free rarely ended well. She kept her eyes on the wound instead of his face, checking a pulse she had already confirmed, buying herself 3 more seconds of silence. He watched her do it. He watched the way her hands stayed perfectly still even as her jaw tightened enough to crack porcelain, and something in his expression shifted, faint as a shadow crossing a wall. Some men look at fear and only see weakness. He looked at her and saw a woman who had simply run out of places left to be afraid. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that never shows up as tears. It shows up as stillness, as a spine that refuses to bend even when the whole body wants to collapse. Kang Hyun had seen that exhaustion in soldiers, in widows, in men counting down their last hours before a debt came due. He had never once seen it in a woman holding a strip of gauze like it was the only thing keeping the world in order. "Zora!" She finally gave it to him the way one hands over a weapon at a checkpoint, flat and without ceremony, because refusing any longer would have meant something it didn't need to mean. "I'm not staying." She said it fast, professional, the kind of sentence built to close a door before anyone could lean against it. He did not argue. He simply watched her stand, watched her gather her bag, watched her decide that distance was the only language she trusted. Taeshik exhaled through his nose, something between relief and disbelief, because in 3 years he had never once seen his boss let a stranger speak to him like that and simply let it pass. Kang Hyun's silence was not agreement. It was something closer to curiosity, an emotion so unfamiliar on his face that even the air in the room seemed to notice it. Taeshik would later tell no one, not even himself, how strange it was to watch his boss let a woman walk toward a door instead of ordering her to sit. Men who crossed Kang Hyun learned quickly that his stillness was not patience. It was calculation, cold and exact, the kind that ended in consequences no one wanted to witness twice. And yet here he was, calculating nothing, simply watching a stranger gather her bag with the quiet, unguarded attention of a man who had forgotten, if only for a moment, what kind of danger he was supposed to represent. Then the door opened, and everything in the penthouse changed its temperature. Dr. Thaddeus Vale stepped through it with the easy confidence of a man walking into his own office, phone in hand, eyes already lowered toward the screen. He looked up. He saw the blood. He saw the men. And for one single beat, too long to be nothing and too brief to be anything anyone else would notice, his face did not show fear at all. It showed recognition, the particular stillness of a man seeing a ghost he had been quietly expecting for years. Zora saw it. She filed it away without understanding what it meant, the way she filed away every strange detail in a building full of them, because pride and instinct had both taught her that noticing things was safer than asking about them out loud. Vale recovered quickly, the way men do when they have rehearsed a moment in their minds 100 times before it ever arrives. "I should notify the board," he said, already turning, already reaching for the calm authority of his title like a coat he had worn so long it no longer needed adjusting. He took one step toward his office, then another. His hand was already halfway to the handle of a locked drawer no one in that room was supposed to know existed. And that was when Kang Hyun spoke, not loudly, not urgently, in a tone so level it made the silence around it feel dangerous by comparison. "Whatever's in that drawer you're walking toward," he said, "leave it closed." Vale stopped walking. His hand hovered an inch from the handle, frozen between two very different versions of his own future, and for the first time all night the fear in the room did not belong to Zora at all. Some men keep their secrets in vaults. Others keep them in drawers they walk past every day, telling themselves the lock is enough. Zora did not know what waited behind that door, only that it had just made the most dangerous man in the room sound almost gentle, the way a hand can be gentle while still closing around a throat. Survival in this city, she had learned, was never about avoiding danger. It was about learning exactly which silences a person could afford to trust. Kang Hyun named the drawer before anyone told him it existed. Sit with how unsettling that is for a second. If you caught it too, say so in the comments. And if you want to know what's inside it, stay close, because the algorithm only shows the next truth to those who are still watching when it arrives. Vale stopped walking, and something in the room shifted the way a house settles after a storm decides which walls will hold. Kang Hyun had not raised his voice. He had not needed to. The silence that followed his words was heavier than any threat could have been, because threats explain themselves, and this had not. Taeshik took one step toward the office anyway, old instinct pulling him forward before thought could catch up to it. Kang Hyun raised 2 fingers, barely lifting his hand from his side, and the movement stopped his own man cold. It was a small gesture. It carried the weight of a locked door. Zora watched the exchange without understanding its language, but she understood its grammar well enough. Whatever waited behind that drawer, it belonged to a conversation older than tonight, older perhaps than she had been alive to witness. She had seen men give orders with raised voices and closed fists. She had never seen one give an order with 2 fingers and total silence, and something about that unsettled her more than the gun ever had. Power, she was beginning to learn, did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply waited, patient as rust, for someone to test it. Then Kang Hyun turned back to her, and for the first time all night his voice carried something other than command. His eyes moved over her the way a man reads a language he has only ever seen written down, never spoken aloud, curious in a way that made him visibly uncomfortable with his own curiosity. There is a particular kind of danger in a man who is used to being obeyed suddenly wanting, instead, to be understood. Kang Hyun had built an empire on the certainty that wanting things made a man weak. Tonight, for reasons he could not yet name, he found himself wanting the woman across the room to simply stay a moment longer, and the wanting itself felt like the first crack in a wall he had spent years reinforcing. "You should go home," he said it plainly, without the weight of an order behind it, which somehow made it land harder than if he had commanded her outright. "Not because I'm telling you to." He paused, and the pause felt deliberate, like a man choosing his words the way other men chose their weapons. "Because it isn't safe to be near what I'm about to do." Zora did not move. She had spent her whole life being told where to stand, when to speak, how small to make herself in rooms built for other people's comfort, and something in her had simply run out of room to comply. It was not loyalty that kept her rooted to that spot. It was the same stubborn refusal that had gotten her through every night shift, every unpaid bill, every man who had ever mistaken her silence for permission. For a moment neither of them spoke. His hand lifted an inch, as if some instinct in him wanted to reach for her elbow, to steer her toward the safety he claimed to want for her, and then he stopped himself, fingers curling back into his palm before the gesture could finish. Zora noticed the aborted motion and said nothing, though something in her chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear. Later she would tell herself it was adrenaline. Later she would not entirely believe it. Tishik exhaled through his teeth, the particular sound of a man watching his careful world grow one variable more complicated. "A debt like this doesn't close when the wound does," he muttered, low enough that it was meant for Kang Hyun and not for her, though the room was too quiet for anything to stay truly private. Kang Hyun did not correct him. He did not confirm him either. He simply let the words settle into the space between them, the way certain truths are allowed to exist without ever being spoken aloud. Zora heard it anyway, the way people always hear the things they are not supposed to, and filed it beside every other strange detail from a night that refused to make sense. Tishik, perhaps sensing the weight in the room, had grown too heavy even for his own comfort, muttered under his breath that he'd seen his boss negotiate with 3 rival families without blinking, and now couldn't manage to tell one stubborn nurse to sit down. Kang Hyun did not dignify that with a response, though the corner of his mouth twitched in a way that, on a less controlled man, might have been mistaken for the beginning of a smile. Even danger, it seemed, occasionally allowed itself a moment of dry humor before returning to business. Her phone buzzed again in her pocket, a small vibration against her hip that felt, in that moment, louder than the rain. Malik. Again. She silenced it without looking, the same practiced motion she had used all night, though this time her jaw tightened hard enough that Kang Hyun noticed it from across the room. She had gotten very good over the years at making her worry invisible. Some skills are learned out of necessity rather than choice, and this was one of hers, sharpened the way a blade is sharpened, not for elegance but for survival. Vale watched all of it from the doorway of his office, close enough to see and far enough to pretend he hadn't. He had built his entire career on being the kind of man people forgot was still in the room, and tonight that particular talent was proving more useful than he could have hoped. He did not know yet what the buzzing phone meant. He only knew that a woman who refused to leave a dangerous man's side was a woman with something worth learning about, and Thaddeus Vale had spent 10 patient years learning exactly how to turn small things into leverage. Some men wait for opportunity. Others simply wait and call it patience, until opportunity forgets they were ever waiting at all. Vale had spent a decade perfecting the art of being underestimated, smiling at hospital boards that had long since stopped asking him hard questions, nodding along at meetings where more powerful men decided things, and never once suspected the quiet administrator in the corner was keeping a ledger of every debt owed to him. It was, he sometimes thought with something close to amusement, remarkably easy to be dangerous when everyone had already decided you were harmless. The room settled, gradually, into a version of calm that felt more like a held breath than actual peace. Kang Hyun gave quiet instructions to Tishik, who left to see the Tide Man moved and questioned elsewhere, his footsteps the only sound besides the rain for several long seconds. Zora used the silence to gather her things again, slower this time, uncertain what leaving even meant anymore in a night that had already rewritten most of her assumptions. She was reaching for the door when she allowed herself, just once, to glance back at Kang Hyun across the room. He was watching her already, had perhaps been watching the entire time, and neither of them looked away first the way strangers usually do. It lasted only a second or two, that look, but seconds like that have a way of rearranging a person's evening without asking permission first. Then Vale's voice found her, soft, almost kind, the particular gentleness of a man who has learned that softness opens more doors than force ever could. "Your brother called the clinic line twice tonight," he said, each word measured, unhurried, the way a man lays cards on a table only when he already knows he holds the winning hand. "Looking for you." Zora's breath caught, though she kept her face carefully arranged into something unreadable, a skill she had practiced since long before tonight. "I told him you were busy," Vale continued, and there was almost warmth in it, almost the tone of a man doing her a kindness. Then he tilted his head slightly, the way people do when they are about to say something they know will cut. He sounded like he owed someone. Zora's voice, when it finally came, was steadier than she felt. "That's not your concern." "No," Vale agreed, far too easily, already turning back toward his office as if the matter had already resolved itself in his favor. Not yet. The words landed exactly where he meant them to land, quiet and precise as a blade slipped between ribs, and for the first time all night, Zora understood that the danger in that building had never belonged to Kang Hyun alone. Some men carry their threats openly, fists ready before words are even necessary. Others carry them quietly in what they simply choose not to say, and those, she was beginning to learn, in a city that rewarded silence over honesty, were always the ones worth fearing most. Vale didn't threaten her. He just let her know exactly how much he already sees. That's a different kind of danger than the one with the gun, and you felt the shift the moment he said it. Stay close if you want to know how much Vale actually knows about her. Or tell me in the comments who scares you more right now, him or Kang Hyun. The stairwell smelled of wet concrete and old cigarettes, the kind of place people used when they didn't want to be found rather than when they needed the exercise. Zora found Malik on the third landing, hood pulled low, rain still dripping from the ends of his sleeves onto the cracked steps below him. His hands were shaking, though he tucked them quickly into his pockets when he saw her, the way a child hides a broken plate behind his back and hopes the sound never happened. "It's handled," he said before she'd even asked the question. "It's fine, don't worry about it." 3 sentences, and every one of them a lie dressed up as reassurance. She had grown up in enough hard rooms to know the fastest way to spot a lie was to count how quickly it arrived, and Malik's had arrived before she'd finished climbing the last flight of stairs. The building's fire door groaned somewhere above them, swinging shut on its own weight, and for a moment the only sound was rain finding its way through a cracked window and dripping onto the landing below. She had heard that particular tone before, mostly from her own mouth, on nights when she'd told herself the same thing about rent, about exhaustion, about a life that kept asking more of her than it ever offered back. Malik shifted his weight, and for half a second his sleeve rode up past his wrist. The bruise underneath was dark, deliberate, the kind that came from fingers rather than an accident, and it sat in almost the exact place where her own old scar traced a pale line along her forearm. Some wounds run in families the way eye color does, passed down not through blood but through circumstance. She reached for his arm before he could pull it back. There is a particular grief in recognizing your own scars on someone you love, a grief that has nothing to do with blame and everything to do with the terrible arithmetic of families who protect each other by lying about exactly how much protecting is needed. Who did this? It wasn't a question so much as a demand wearing the shape of one. Malik pulled his sleeve back down, the old practiced motion of a boy who'd spent years hiding things from a sister who noticed everything anyway. It doesn't matter who. It matters to me. That's exactly the problem, Zora. His voice cracked on her name, frustration and love tangled together in a way that made it hard to tell where one ended and the other began. I didn't want you carrying one more thing. He said it like an apology and a defense at once, the way people do when they know they've done something wrong for reasons that still felt right at the time. You already carry enough for both of us, Zora. There was something almost boyish in the way he said her name, the same way he'd said it as a 10-year-old asking her to check under his bed for monsters. Except this time the monster had a name and a payment schedule. That's not your decision to make for me. The words came out sharper than she'd meant them, though she didn't take them back. She had spent years being the one who carried things quietly, who absorbed every hard thing so the people she loved wouldn't have to, that the idea of Malik doing the same for her felt less like protection and more like theft. He looked away first, jaw working, and for a moment the two of them stood in a stairwell that smelled like rain and unpaid debts, saying nothing at all, because sometimes love and resentment wear each other's clothes so well that nobody in the room can tell them apart. She left without an answer, because some conversations need distance before they can finish honestly. She returned to the clinic with rain still clinging to her shoulders and something harder to name clinging to her chest. The stillness she had worn like armor all night now had a fracture running through it, faint but visible to anyone paying close enough attention. Kang Hyun was paying that kind of attention. He noticed it the moment she walked back through the door, the same way a man notices a hairline crack in glass he had assumed was solid. He did not ask if she was fine, because he had already watched her lie about that once tonight, and recognized the shape of it too well to ask again. Some men mistake silence for absence. Kang Hyun had learned, over a lifetime reading rooms before they turned dangerous, that silence was often where the truth waited most patiently, and he had no intention of rushing it out before it was ready. "Who put that look on your face?" He asked it plainly, without performance, the question of a man who had learned that most people preferred their pain wrapped in something gentler than a direct question. Zora opened her mouth to deflect, the way she deflected everything, and found that for the first time all night the lie simply refused to come. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the particular relief of being asked a real question by someone who wasn't asking to use the answer against her. Either way, she found herself telling him the truth instead. "My brother," she said. "He's in debt to people who don't forgive slowly." Kang Hyun's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did, the way weather shifts before anyone outside notices the sky has darkened. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he called Tishik over with a single glance, the kind of silent command that years of loyalty had made unnecessary to explain. Tishik pulled up the clinic's exterior camera feed on his phone, scrolling back through the grainy footage without needing to be told what to look for. "Same car," he said, turning the screen toward Kang Hyun. 6 nights running, always parked before her shift starts, always gone by the time it ends. He paused, glancing briefly at Zora with something almost like dry sympathy. "For what it's worth, you're not the first person these people have made feel like you were imagining things. Making you doubt your own eyes is sort of their whole business model." It was, in its own grim way, the closest thing to comfort Tishik knew how to offer, and Zora almost laughed despite everything, the short, surprised laugh of someone finding humor in the worst possible moment. Zora felt something cold settle low in her stomach, a recognition arriving several seconds behind the memory that triggered it. She had seen that car before. Weeks ago, parked at the same odd angle across the street, and she had told herself it was nothing. The way people tell themselves most dangerous things are nothing right up until the night they aren't. Whoever had been circling her life hadn't started tonight. They had been watching long before Kang Hyun ever bled out on her table, patient in the particular way that predators are patient when they already know exactly which door they intend to walk through eventually. Kang Hyun watched the realization move across her face and felt something in his own chest tighten in response. An old, familiar coldness he recognized not as sympathy, but as something closer to kinship. He was not comforting her out of pity. He understood, with total clarity, exactly what kind of men she was describing, because he had spent the better part of his life being one of them. Some men learn danger from books or warnings. Others learn it because they grew up inside it, and Kang Hyun had grown up so far inside it that recognizing its shape in her life felt less like empathy and more like a mirror he usually kept carefully covered. He thought, briefly, of his own father's hands, and of debts that had taken decades rather than months to close. "Say the name," he told Tishik quietly, eyes never leaving Zora's face. Tishik hesitated only a second, the particular hesitation of a man about to say a word that would change the shape of the entire night. "Cho," he said finally. The name landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water, small in itself, but sending ripples outward that touched everything it reached. It was the same name flagged inside the locked drawer Vale had been walking toward hours earlier, the same name now attached to a car that had haunted Zora's street for 6 patient nights, and the same name that, for reasons none of them had said aloud yet, made even Kang Hyun's carefully controlled stillness go, for just a moment, entirely quiet. Some secrets take years to surface. Others simply wait, patient as that black car in the rain. For the night every separate thread realizes it was never separate at all. 2 threads that felt separate all night just became one, and a car she'd already decided meant nothing turns out to have been the clearest warning of all. If that landed for you the way it should have, that's the story doing its job. Stay close if you want to watch it pull tight. Or tell me in the comments who you think Vale's really been protecting. The full picture arrived the way most terrible truths do, not all at once but piece by piece, each one small enough to seem survivable until they were stacked together and impossible to look away from. Tishik's men had spent less than an hour confirming what Kang Hyun had already suspected the moment a single name landed in that quiet room. Vale had been feeding information to Cho's syndicate for 10 years, not for money, though money had certainly made the arrangement easier to live with. He had been paid in something rarer than currency, a promise, made a decade ago, that the men who destroyed his career would eventually be made to answer for it. Some men spend their anger. Others invest it, patiently, the way Vale had, letting a decade of quiet humiliation compound into something he mistook for justice. He had learned, across those 10 years, to smile at the very people who had ended his surgical career, to nod along in meetings where his opinion no longer mattered, all while quietly building the machinery of his own reckoning one favor at a time. The clinic had never been the act of charity its donors believed it to be. It had been built, brick by careful brick, as a listening post, a place where powerful men occasionally bled and powerless men occasionally talked, and Vale had simply positioned himself in the one chair from which he could hear everything. He had waited 10 years for a night exactly like this one. Somewhere in that waiting, patience had curdled into something closer to hunger, and Zora understood, with the particular clarity that arrives only after danger has already passed through a room, that she had spent months working beside a man who had been quietly starving the entire time. There is a particular kind of grief in realizing that patience, weaponized carefully enough, can look exactly like kindness for years before it ever shows its true shape. Worse still, and this was the detail that made Kang Hyun go very quiet in the particular way that meant something dangerous was assembling itself behind his eyes, Malik's debt had never been an accident. Cho's people did not simply stumble onto a young man drowning in bad decisions. They had gone looking for him the moment someone whispered whose sister he happened to be, and they had built his debt deliberately, patiently, the way a trap is built around bait rather than around the animal itself. Zora had spent the whole night believing her brother's trouble was ordinary bad luck, the kind every family absorbs eventually. It had never been luck at all. It had been architecture, designed months in advance by people who understood, long before she did, exactly how much a woman like her would sacrifice to protect the people she loved. There is a particular cruelty in being loved as a weakness rather than a person, in discovering that your devotion has been catalogued and measured by someone patient enough to wait for the right night to use it against you. Zora thought of every extra shift she had picked up to help Malik with rent, every excuse she had made for his silences, and felt something in her chest curdle at the thought that all of it had been watched, quietly, by people counting on exactly that kind of love. Kang Hyun's response was not rage, though rage would have been easier to predict and easier still to manage. It was something colder, something that settled into his shoulders like a decision already made and simply waiting for its moment to be executed. He was no longer thinking about Zora as a debt he owed for a night of bleeding on her table. That accounting had closed itself somewhere in the last few hours without either of them announcing it. What remained now was something he had not felt in longer than he cared to admit, an instinct that did not ask permission or calculate cost. The simple and dangerous need to protect something he had quietly decided belonged to him to protect. "Where is Vale now?" he asked, and his voice had gone so level it frightened Tishik more than shouting ever could have. "Still in the building," Tishik said, already moving toward the door, though he paused just long enough to add, half under his breath, "For what it's worth, I always thought there was something off about a man who kept a locked drawer in an office nobody was allowed to clean." It was, even now, the closest thing to a joke either of them could manage, a small release valve for tension that had grown too heavy to hold without one. The answer arrived before anyone could give it, in the form of a phone buzzing in Zora's pocket for the third time that night, except this call was not from Malik. It was the hospital board's after-hours line, the number every nurse memorized and dreaded in equal measure, and Zora felt her stomach drop before she'd even answered it. Vale, cornered by a conversation he did not know had already happened, had done the only thing a man like him knew how to do when a decade of careful planning began collapsing. He had reported her. Unlicensed treatment of a patient outside clinic protocol, performed on hospital property, involving a man now confirmed to have organized crime connections, was the kind of sentence that ended careers quietly and permanently, and Vale had written it with the practiced calm of a man who had been composing it in his head for hours. By the time Zora arrived back at the clinic, badge already requested at the front desk. 2 board members were waiting for her beneath the fluorescent lights she had worked under for 3 years without a single complaint on her file. The suspension was immediate, delivered in the flat, apologetic tone hospitals reserve for decisions they've already made before the conversation starts. She walked out past colleagues who glanced up from their charts with confused, searching expressions, none of them understanding what she had actually done or why, only that the nurse who never caused trouble was suddenly being escorted out like she had. Some humiliations are loud. This one was worse, because it was quiet, professional, and utterly without malice, which somehow made it feel less survivable rather than more. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody accused her of anything beyond the paperwork's careful language, and that particular gentleness was its own kind of violence, the sort that leaves no mark anyone else can see, but changes the shape of a person permanently from the inside. She found Kang Hyun waiting outside beneath an awning that did little against the slanting rain, and for the first time all night, her composure finally broke into something sharper than exhaustion. "You cost me my job," she said, and her voice carried none of the careful control she had maintained through every other trial of the evening. 3 years, and I lost it in one night because I decided to save your life." She pressed a hand to her own chest, as if she could physically hold together something that had already come apart. Kang Hyun did not defend himself, because there was nothing in her accusation that was factually wrong, only larger than the frame she was seeing it through. "I know what it cost you," he said finally, quietly, the rain running in dark lines down the collar of his suit. "I'm not going to insult you by pretending otherwise." Zora laughed, short and humorless, the sound of someone standing at the edge of an exhaustion too large to argue with. "That's supposed to help." "No," he said. "It's supposed to be true. I found people trust the truth more than they trust comfort, even when the truth is the one thing they didn't want to hear." "You think this was about the clinic's reputation," he said quietly, letting the rain fall between them rather than raising his voice to compete with it. "It wasn't. Vale didn't report you to protect some name on a building." Zora stared at him, waiting, because she recognized by now the particular stillness he wore right before delivering something that would rearrange everything she thought she understood. "Once Cho's people had your brother. Vale didn't need you convenient to protect anymore." He paused, and something in his expression made the rain between them feel suddenly much colder. "He needed you gone." Zora felt the words settle into her slowly, the way cold water finds every gap in a coat that had seemed, moments earlier, warm enough. Some men destroy what they can no longer use. Others simply discard it quietly, without ceremony or apology, and there is a particular grief in learning you were never protected at all, only convenient, right up until the exact moment someone decided you weren't. She built her whole life on not needing anyone, and in one night she lost her job for saving a stranger and found out her brother was bait the whole time. That's not a small thing to sit with quietly. Stay close if you need to see her get it back on her own terms, or tell me in the comments what you think she does next, because I don't think it's what he expects. Kang Hyun did not go to the hospital board and did not threaten a single person into silence, though every instinct sharpened over a lifetime of solving problems that Wei pulled at him to do exactly that. Instead, he made 2 calls before dawn, quiet ones, the kind that moved money and paperwork rather than fists. The board's complaint against Zora, so carefully worded the night before, developed the particular kind of clerical trouble that makes formal accusations simply evaporate, misfiled and unfindable by people who had never been especially motivated to find it in the first place. Malik's debt, meanwhile, was purchased in full before sunrise, quietly enough that Cho's men learned of it only after the leverage they had spent months building had already dissolved in their hands. Some men fix things loudly, so everyone can see the fixing. Kang Hyun fixed things the way water erodes stone, patiently, invisibly, until one day the obstacle simply wasn't there anymore. Taeshik, watching the arrangements unfold from a respectful distance, could not help but notice how differently his boss moved through this particular problem compared to every other one that had crossed his desk in the last decade. There were no raised voices, no late-night meetings bristling with threat, only a series of quiet, precise decisions made by a man who seemed, for the first time in longer than Taeshik could remember, to be solving something for a reason that had nothing to do with power at all. Zora learned about all of it secondhand, in a phone call from a colleague who mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her suspension paperwork had apparently never existed. She felt anger first, sharp and immediate, the particular fury of a woman who had spent her whole life clawing solutions out of impossible situations herself, and did not appreciate discovering one handed to her without her knowledge or consent. She had not asked to be rescued. She had barely allowed herself to be helped, and there was a particular indignity in discovering that the one thing she had spent her whole adult life refusing to need had simply been given to her anyway, without so much as a conversation. For a moment she considered calling him just to say so, to tell him plainly that gratitude was not the same as consent, and that a woman who had built her entire life on carrying her own weight did not appreciate someone quietly removing it from her shoulders while she wasn't looking. But the anger did not last as long as she expected it to. Somewhere between the second and third time she replayed the conversation in her head, she recognized the difference between a man who fixes something to control you and a man who fixes something and then simply steps back, expecting nothing, not even gratitude, in return. Being rescued implied a debt. Being backed implied only that someone believed she could carry the weight herself and had simply made sure the ground beneath her didn't collapse while she did it. It was a distinction so small most people would never notice it, and yet Zora understood, standing alone in her kitchen with rain still ticking against the glass, that it was the entire difference between every man who had ever claimed to protect her and the one currently doing it without asking for anything at all. She almost laughed, then, at the strange arithmetic of her life, that it had taken a wounded mafia boss bleeding out on her exam table to teach her the difference between a man who wanted to own her safety and one who simply wanted it to exist. The reckoning for Vale arrived with none of the mercy he had spent a decade avoiding. It came not from Kang Hyun's men, but from his own hospital board, presented with a decade of financial records T-shicks people had quietly assembled and delivered through channels that traced back to absolutely no one. The trusted advisor halo that had protected Vale through years of quiet betrayal came off entirely in a single meeting, in front of the very colleagues who had trusted him longest and most completely. There is a particular humiliation reserved for men who spend years being underestimated and then discover, all at once, that underestimation was never protection. It was simply patience, waiting for the moment it would no longer be necessary to pretend. Vale said nothing in his own defense, because there was nothing left to say that the ledgers hadn't already said more convincingly, and the silence that followed his exposure was, in its own way, the loudest sound in the room. Somewhere in that silence was the particular grief of a man who had spent a decade believing his suffering entitled him to become the very predator that had once destroyed him, only to discover it had cost him the respectability he'd told himself he was owed. Kang Hyun found her again that evening, in the same clinic doorway where all of it had started, though the building felt different now, lighter somehow, as if it too understood something had finally been set right. "The debt I owed you closed the night you saved my life," he said without preamble, because he had never been a man who wasted words on softening a truth that didn't need softening. "Everything since then has been my choice, not an obligation, not a transaction." Zora studied him for a long moment, the rain outside finally softening into something closer to mist, and felt the particular vertigo of being told, plainly, that she had never been a debt to begin with. "Most men," she said slowly, testing the words as she spoke them, "would have let me keep believing I owed you something. It's easier that way, keeps people close." "I've never been interested in easy," he said, and something in the flatness of his delivery made it land less like a line and more like a confession he hadn't planned on giving. She did not thank him. Gratitude, she had learned long ago, had a way of becoming its own kind of debt, and she was done owing anyone anything tonight. "So what do you actually want from me?" she asked instead, arms crossed, daring him to answer with the same rehearsed control he used on everyone else in his life. He opened his mouth, and then, for the first time since she had met him, closed it again without an answer ready. It was the not knowing, more than anything he could have said, that told her he meant it. Later, alone at the clinic window, Zora watched the rain fall steadily against glass that had seen an entire lifetime pass through it in the space of one impossible night. The black car appeared one final time, idling in its familiar spot across the street, patient as it had always been. This time its window lowered 3 inches, slow and deliberate. A gloved hand rested on the sill, still, saying nothing, threatening nothing, simply present the way a held breath is present before it's finally released. It stayed there for 3 full seconds, long enough to be seen and understood, and then the window rose again, and the car pulled away into the rain, taillights dissolving into red smears against wet asphalt. Zora did not know yet what that gesture meant, whether it was warning or acknowledgement or something stranger still, a message meant only for someone patient enough to be watching back. She only knew that some silences carry more weight than any words could, and that the city she had lived in her entire life had just shown her, quietly, that it was far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever allowed herself to believe. Her phone lit up in her hand a moment later. Malik, safe, and thanking her for something he clearly did not fully understand the size of. His message warm and easy in a way that made her chest ache with how much innocence still remained in him despite everything. She read it once, quietly, a small and genuine smile arriving despite the exhaustion carved into every part of her. Then she looked back out at the empty street where the car used to be, at the space it left behind, and understood, with the particular clarity that only arrives at the end of very long nights, that some doors, once opened, never fully close again. Some nights end quietly, with nothing resolved except the certainty that tomorrow will require different courage than tonight did. Zora set the phone down on the windowsill, pressed her palm against the cool glass, and allowed herself, for the first time since the elevator doors had opened onto a stranger's blood, to simply breathe without calculating what came next. Whatever waited on the other side of that gloved hand's silent visit, she would meet it standing, the way she had met everything else in a life that had never once asked her permission before testing her. Vale's gone, but that car pulling away means Cho isn't. Should the next story follow Cho settling his score, or Malik finding out exactly what his sister did for him? Comment your pick and subscribe, because this one isn't finished.